let's talk about applying the CSS to the HTML. So you've learned the basics of building bare bones HTML page already and the basic structure of writing a CSS rule, okay? But let's look at how the rules are actually applied to the HTML pages in the next slides. Okay, so there are three main ways of applying these CSS rules. You have external style sheets, so external CSS. You have embedded styles, all right, which would be referred to as embedded CSS, and you have inline CSS. And I'll show you what inline looks like. And just to give you my opinion, and it's sort of like a pretty standard opinion across the industry, is that for external style sheets, those are the best choices, hands down, for multi-page websites. And the reason is that they have global controls, sort of, you know, like having a master that can control all of its minions, right? It says one thing and everybody will follow suit, right? Everybody falls in line and does what it's supposed to do. And so it's nice because you can go to one place to change globally all of your styles and potentially hundreds or even thousands of pages, depending on how big the website is. Don't worry, yours aren't going to get that big in this class, I promise. Anyway, embedded CSS is a little less favorable because of the way that it's embedded in pages, and I'll explain that in a minute, but it is sort of acceptable for single pages of HTML that are not supposed to really exist in the context of other web pages or assets. And inline is really rarely acceptable. Okay, so let's look at external CSS, since that's the one that I said is kind of the best option. So external uses a separate CSS file. So you'll have your HTML page or pages, right? And then you'll have an external style sheet or multiple style sheets if you want to do it that way. You can have more than one style sheet. But anyway, but generally, at least for this class, you're going to have one style sheet with, for most of your assignments. And that one style sheet is going to style all of your web pages. Like let's say that you've got a 5-page website. Well, you're going to have one style sheet that will like control the rules that cascade down to all of those HTML pages for their presentation. And they can control multiple HTML files, as I just said. And this is a preferred choice because it does allow scalability in websites, and you can just go to that one spot and make a change to the color of the text or the color of your links or whatever, change a background image, and it cascades across the entire website, so you don't have to go and do it individually in every single page. Okay, here's an example of the way that you would actually link your style sheet to your HTML file. So in your HTML file, in all of this HTML files that you would have, up in the head of the document, you create this link with a tag that's called the link tag. And you can see here that it says link as the tag name, and then the attribute is href. Remember, it's a hyperreference, and this tells it, hey, you got to go somewhere else to get this link. Okay, and then the value of that is the pathway where that file exists. So in this case, we're saying, okay, link, go to the CSS folder to find the main.css style sheet. And then it says, hey, the relationship, this is another attribute, the rel is relationship. The relationship of this thing that I'm going to go get is that it's a style sheet, right? And then you can also tell it that it's text CSS, but this part right here is not necessary any longer in HTML5. But the rel style sheet is, and the href definitely is if you're using the link tag. Okay, let's talk about embedded CSS now. How is that different? Literally, it's embedded in the head of the document, of the HTML document. And embedded CSS uses the style tag. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a second, but the style tag would go up inside of the head of an HTML document. You can use the style tag in other parts of the document as well, but typically, you'd want to put it in the head of the document so that the document can load up all of its styling and know how to treat the rest of the page. So anyway, you'd put it in the head of the document so that everything in the body knows how to be when it's presented. Here's an example. So if you were to look at the head of this document here, what we have is a style tag, and then we have a style that's written right inside of it with a paragraph selector, a paragraph HTML type of selector, and then we've got some different rules or different declarations for it that's talking about font family, font size, color, okay? Okay, and then something else about embedded CSS is that it's not typically preferable to external style sheets because it lacks global site possibilities. So you can notice if you go back to this slide, you notice that this means that it has to be embedded in the actual head of every document, of every HTML document. So let's say you have a web page that's like got or a website that has, I don't know, 10 or 15 pages. It means that you would have to go and write the styles, embed them in separate instances for 15 separate pages. And what happens then when you want to go change the color or the font size of one of those things, you know, and then it means you have to do it in 15 different places, right? So that's why it's kind of like less preferable to external HTML. It is, however, good for single pages that need to be unencumbered by a folder structure. So like, for instance, like if you were to send just like a little tutorial page or something that you wanted to show an example of how something is supposed to look, but you don't want to have a bunch of, you don't want to have a bunch of style sheets that you have to that also port around with it. Well, then you could just embed the stuff in the top. So it's good for something like that, some little bitty thing, right? So again, let's recap the disadvantages of embedded CSS. It will override external CSS if you mistakenly create or leave embedded rules where it's unintended. If you leave embedded material where it's unintended, then it's going to override any external style sheets that you might go and attach later. And the reason I say this is that a lot of times, like especially if you're using a tool like Dreamweaver or something, it's really easy to just accidentally start writing, or even on purpose, start writing embedded styles so that you don't have to think about linking out your external style sheets in the beginning. And then you start to make stuff look the way you want. And a lot of times people will then go and lift, like they'll cut all of their rules, their styles out of the top of the page, and then they'll create an external style sheet whenever they want to start creating a lot of pages. Well, the problem with that is that a lot of times people forget to do it. And then they start to duplicate that file, and then it has those embedded styles in there, and then they can't figure out a lot of times why something isn't changing whenever they go to change it in the external style sheet. Maybe you still have an embedded rule somewhere that's overriding it. So that's a problem. The other thing that is a disadvantage of embedded, I guess you could call it a disadvantage, it just is the way it is that it is overridden by inline rules, which we haven't talked about yet. But just remember that inline will trump embedded, and then embedded will trump external, okay? So again, advantages where you actually really and truly intend to do it, it can be useful in overriding global styles and external style sheets. We're not going to really get to that place in this class. This would be sort of a little bit more like with advanced applications of automatically generated code and stuff. We're not going to get to that place in this class. So for our intents and purposes, embedded is never as good as external, and inline is definitely the worst of all of them, all right? And I already mentioned that it can make a single styled HTML page portable on its own. That's an advantage. Okay, let's talk lastly about inline CSS and wrap this up. I think of inline CSS as sort of like a little bit like the devil when it comes to styling. It can really mess with stuff. There are some legitimately good uses of inline CSS, so I don't want you to walk around forever thinking that this is the worst thing ever. It's not, but for the purposes of what we're going to be doing in this class, it kind of is. It's something that I'm pretty much going to prohibit that you use in a beginning class, because it's considered at this level, if you're writing inline stuff, it's kind of considered to be lazy and sloppy. The only reasons that you would use it sort of in the future is if you're using dynamically generated code, like if you're writing JavaScript or you're using some kind of server-side scripting where you have to insert things dynamically into a page by auto generation. That's pretty much the only time that it's kind of acceptable. Otherwise, it's a really bad thing in general. So here's an example of the way that CSS looks whenever it's inline. So you can see that it uses this, right? Remember, embedded used a style tag, right? Well, inline uses a style attribute. So it means that you would make an attribute called style for some other tag. Like in this case, we're styling a paragraph tag inline by saying P as the P tag, and then the attribute of P is style equals, right? And then we give the value, and the value of style is going to be a set of declaration blocks, right? In this example, we just have one declaration block where we're trying to say that it has a padding of 2 pixels. You could have multiple declarations. I do want to say, though, that the problems with inline CSS is that it's really undesirable for most uses due to its inability to have global controls. Okay. The other thing is that it does trump embedded and external styles. You can have the most amazing style sheet written, but if you use inline styles, it's no matter what you do, it's going to override anything else that might be a conflict. You know, if you tried to give paragraphs the same color of text, well, if you have an inline style that gives it that color of text, it's always going to win, okay? And it makes global changes impossible on those elements, so that's problematic.